Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to wake up at your own funeral? I mean, really think about that for a second. The absolute terror, the confusion, the sheer impossibility of it all. Well, I'm James Mitchell, and I'm the limousine driver who stopped a billionaire's funeral procession because I saw something that nobody else did. What I'm about to tell you changed my life forever, and it exposed secrets so dark that even now, years later, I still wake up in cold sweats thinking about that day. This isn't just another story about the wealthy and their problems. This is about life, death, and the thin line between them that we all take for granted. This is about betrayal at the deepest level imaginable, and about having the courage to trust your instincts, even when the entire world tells you you're wrong. So buckle up, because what happened that gray November morning will shake you to your core, and I promise you, nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered. I had been driving for Whitmore Estate Services for almost 15 years. 15 years of transporting the elite, the powerful, the untouchable members of society who lived in a world so different from mine that we might as well have been from different planets. I'd driven celebrities to award shows, politicians to secret meetings, and countless wealthy families to both celebrations and funerals. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for November 18th. The morning started like any other funeral service I'd handled. Cold, gray, with that peculiar heavy silence that seems to blanket everything when death is involved. I arrived at the Whitmore mansion at 6 in the morning to prepare the hearse, a magnificent black Cadillac that had been specially customized for the family. Margaret Whitmore, the matriarch of one of the wealthiest families in the entire country, had supposedly died 3 days earlier from a sudden heart attack. She was only 62 years old, and by all accounts, she had been in perfect health just weeks before. The whole thing felt wrong to me from the start, but I kept my thoughts to myself. Who was I? Just a driver, to question the death of a billionaire. The mansion was enormous, one of those old money estates that seemed to have more rooms than a small hotel. I'd been there countless times over the years, driving Margaret to charity events, business meetings, and family gatherings. She was always kind to me, which was rare among the wealthy clients I served. She remembered my name, asked about my daughter's college applications, and always tipped generously during the holidays. She wasn't just another rich person to me. She was one of the few who treated me like a human being, and that made what I was about to experience even more devastating. As I polished the hearse that morning, my hands trembling slightly in the cold air, I couldn't shake this gnawing feeling in my gut. Something felt off about her death. Margaret had been vibrant, full of life, planning a massive expansion of her charitable foundation. She'd told me just 2 weeks earlier that she'd never felt better, that she was finally ready to step back from the day-to-day business operations and focus on giving back. And then suddenly, she was gone. A heart attack, they said. Quick, unexpected, tragic. The family started gathering around 7:30. Her son, Richard Whitmore, arrived first in his own limousine, his face carefully composed in an expression of grief that somehow seemed rehearsed. I'd driven Richard before, and let me tell you, that man was about as warm as a frozen lake in January. He barely acknowledged my existence, treating me like I was part of the car's upholstery. His wife, Veronica, was right behind him, dripping in black Chanel and diamonds that seemed inappropriate for a funeral. But then again, that was Veronica. Everything about her screamed, "Look at me," even at her mother-in-law's funeral. Then came Margaret's daughter, Patricia, with her husband Thomas. Patricia had always been the kinder of the two children, more like her mother in temperament. Her eyes were red and swollen, and unlike her brother, her grief seemed genuine. The extended family trickled in over the next hour, along with business associates, society friends, and what seemed like half the city's elite. Everyone dressed in expensive black, everyone wearing the same mask of socially acceptable mourning. I stood by the hearse, watching this parade of privilege, and I felt increasingly uneasy. Maybe it was the way Richard kept checking his watch, as if his mother's funeral was just another appointment on his busy schedule. Maybe it was the whispered conversations I caught fragments of, discussions about stock prices and company valuations that seemed grotesquely out of place. Or maybe it was something deeper, something my subconscious was picking up on that I couldn't quite articulate. Have you ever had that feeling where every cell in your body is screaming that something is wrong, but you can't point to any specific thing? That's exactly how I felt that morning. My hands were sweating despite the cold, and I kept having to wipe them on my uniform pants. I'd been to dozens of funerals in my career, But this one felt different. This one felt dangerous, though I couldn't have told you why. The funeral director, a man named Mr. Pemberton, who I'd worked with many times, approached me around 9 o'clock. He was a tall, thin man who always moved with the careful precision of someone who spent their days around grief and death. He handed me the schedule for the day, explained the route to the cathedral, and then to the family cemetery plot about 40 minutes outside the city. It was a straightforward job, the kind I could do in my sleep. But as he walked away, I noticed something odd. Mr. Pemberton seemed nervous. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his tie, and he kept glancing back at the mansion with an expression I couldn't quite read. Fear, anxiety, guilt? I couldn't tell, but it added another layer to my growing unease. I wanted to ask him if everything was okay, but the words stuck in my throat. What would I even say? That I had a bad feeling? That something seemed off about a situation I knew almost nothing about? At 9:30, they brought out the casket. It was an elaborate affair, solid mahogany with gold fixtures, probably worth more than I'd make in 5 years. 6 pallbearers, all in matching black suits, carried it with practiced precision. The family followed behind, and I watched their faces carefully. Richard's expression was still that same mask of appropriate grief, but his eyes were cold, calculating. Veronica dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, but I never saw actual tears. Patricia was genuinely crying, her whole body shaking with sobs as her husband supported her. And there, in the middle of all this carefully orchestrated mourning, I felt it again. That wrongness, that sense that I was watching a performance rather than witnessing genuine grief. The casket was loaded into the hearse with reverent care, and I got behind the wheel, my heart pounding harder than it should have been for such a routine task. The procession formed behind me. At least 30 cars, all black, all expensive, all carrying people who probably had more money in their wallets than I had in my savings account. I pulled out slowly, leading this parade of wealth and privilege through the city streets. The route to the cathedral took us through the historic district, past buildings that had stood for centuries, witnesses to countless lives and deaths. I drove carefully, maintaining exactly the right speed, not too fast, not too slow, every movement deliberate, professional. But inside I was anything but calm. My mind kept racing, turning over every detail of the morning, searching for what was bothering me so much. And then I remembered something Margaret had told me during one of our drives. She'd been talking about her will, about how she was planning to change it. She wanted to leave the bulk of her fortune to her charitable foundation, to causes she believed in. She'd seemed excited about it, liberated even, but she'd also mentioned that Richard wouldn't be happy. Those were her exact words. Richard won't be happy, but it's my money and I'll do with it what I want. I remembered the steel in her voice when she said it, the determination of a woman who'd built an empire and wasn't about to let anyone tell her what to do with it. The cathedral appeared ahead, its Gothic spires reaching toward the overcast sky like accusing fingers. We pulled up to the entrance and the pallbearers carefully unloaded the casket. I watched them carry Margaret inside, and I had this overwhelming urge to stop them, to say something, anything. But what could I say? That I had a feeling, that something seemed wrong. I'd be laughed out of my job, probably blacklisted from ever working with wealthy clients again. So I kept my mouth shut and followed the procession inside, taking my place at the back of the cathedral where the staff and drivers waited during services. The ceremony was long, filled with eulogies that painted Margaret as a saint, a visionary, a beloved mother and philanthropist. Some of it was true. Margaret had been genuinely good in many ways, but listening to Richard talk about his beloved mother, about how much he'd miss her guidance and wisdom, made my stomach turn. The words were right, but the emotion behind them was hollow. I'd seen more genuine feeling from actors in bad movies. After what felt like hours, the service ended, and it was time to proceed to the family cemetery. This was it, the final journey. I got back in the hearse, waited for the casket to be loaded, and started the 40-minute drive out of the city. The procession followed, snaking through the streets like a long black serpent. As we left the city limits and entered the countryside, I felt my anxiety increase. The road to the cemetery was narrow, winding through dense woods that seemed to close in on either side. It was the kind of place that felt isolated, cut off from the rest of the world. Perfect for a peaceful final resting place, or perfect for secrets to stay buried forever. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white with tension. The trees overhead blocked out most of the already dim light, creating shadows that seemed to move and shift in my peripheral vision. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was letting my imagination run wild, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Or maybe something terrible had already happened and I was the only one who suspected it. We were about 20 minutes into the drive deep in the woods when I heard it. A sound so faint that at first I thought I'd imagined it. A small thump, like something shifting in the back of the hearse. I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart suddenly racing. Nothing. Just the casket. Perfectly still. Perfectly silent. I must have imagined it. Grief and anxiety playing tricks on my mind. But then I heard it again, slightly louder this time, and then, God help me, I saw it. Movement. The slightest movement from inside the casket. My blood ran cold. My hands started shaking so badly I nearly swerved off the road. I told myself it was impossible, that I was seeing things that caskets don't move on their own. But then I saw it again, unmistakable this time. The casket lid shifted, just a fraction of an inch, but it definitely moved. And that's when I heard the sound that would haunt my dreams for years to come. A muffled groan, weak and desperate, coming from inside the casket. Someone was alive in there. Margaret Whitmore was alive in her own coffin, and I was driving her to be buried. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stop the car immediately. But another part of my brain, the part that had been trained to follow protocol, to never make scenes, to respect the wishes of wealthy clients, hesitated. What if I was wrong? What if I stopped this funeral procession based on sounds that could have a dozen explanations? I'd lose my job, be sued probably, become a laughingstock. But then I heard it again, louder, more desperate. A scratching sound, like fingernails on wood. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that Margaret Whitmore was alive and trying to get out. I didn't think. I just acted. I slammed on the brakes, bringing the hearse to an abrupt stop in the middle of the narrow road. Behind me I heard the screech of tires as the other cars in the procession braked to avoid hitting me. Car horns started blaring, angry and confused. I threw the car into park and jumped out, not caring about protocol, not caring about anything except getting to that casket and opening it. I ran to the back of the hearse, my hands fumbling with the door. People were getting out of their cars now, shouting questions at me. What's wrong? Why did we stop? Is there a problem with the car? I ignored them all. I yanked open the hearse door and reached for the casket, but it was heavy. Too heavy for one person to move easily. Richard appeared beside me, his face red with anger. What the hell do you think you're doing? He demanded, grabbing my arm. You can't just stop in the middle of the procession. I shook him off, barely hearing his words. She's alive, I said, my voice coming out strangled and desperate. Mrs. Whitmore's alive. I heard her. She's moving in there. The words sounded insane even as I said them, but I didn't care. Richard's face went pale, then flushed and even deeper red. That's impossible, he said, but there was something in his voice. Fear? Panic? You're being ridiculous. It's just the car moving, settling. No, I shouted, loud enough that everyone gathering around us went silent. I heard her. She's alive in there. We need to open it now. Mr. Pemberton, the funeral director, pushed through the crowd. His face was ashen and his hands were shaking visibly now. Mr. Mitchell, please, he said, his voice quavering. This is highly irregular. You can't just... But I wasn't listening anymore. I reached for the casket lid, trying to figure out how to open it. Patricia appeared on my other side, her face streaked with tears. What did you hear? She asked urgently, gripping my shoulder. Tell me exactly what you heard. I met her eyes and saw genuine hope there mixed with terror. I heard groaning, I said quickly, and scratching, like she's trying to get out. We have to open it, now. Patricia didn't hesitate. She turned to the pallbearers who had gathered nearby. Help him, she ordered. Open it, now. Richard tried to object, stepping forward with his hands raised. Patricia, think about what you're doing. This is insane. Mother is dead. We have the death certificate. This is just... Shut up, Richard! Patricia screamed at him, and the raw emotion in her voice silenced everyone. If there's even a chance, even the smallest possibility that she's alive, we have to check. Now help us open this casket, or get out of the way. The pallbearers looked at each other uncertain, then at Mr. Pemberton. The funeral director seemed paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing, but no words coming out. Finally, one of the pallbearers, a young man with kind eyes, stepped forward. "I'll help," he said quietly. Together we worked to open the casket. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the latches. Everything seemed to move in slow motion, and yet too fast at the same time. The crowd around us had grown silent, everyone holding their breath. I could feel dozens of eyes on us, watching, judging, waiting. And then we got the first latch open. Then the second. The lid was heavy, designed to seal shut securely, but we managed to lift it. And what we saw inside made several people in the crowd scream. Margaret Whitmore's eyes were open. Her hand was raised, trembling against the satin lining of the casket. Her mouth was moving, trying to form words, but no sound was coming out. Her face was deathly pale. Her lips blue, but she was alive. Dear God, she was alive. Time seemed to stop completely. For a moment, nobody moved. We all just stood there, staring in absolute horror and disbelief at the impossible sight before us. Then Patricia screamed, a sound of pure anguish mixed with relief, and lunged toward her mother. "Mom! Oh my God, Mom!" She reached into the casket, taking Margaret's hand, touching her face. "Call an ambulance," I shouted, finally finding my voice. "Someone call 911 right now." People scrambled for their phones. The pallbearer who had helped me open the casket was already on his phone, speaking urgently to an emergency dispatcher. I looked at Margaret's face, at her eyes that were full of terror and confusion, and I felt rage building inside me. This wasn't an accident. This couldn't be an accident. You don't accidentally seal a living person in a casket. You don't accidentally schedule a funeral for someone who isn't dead. Someone had done this deliberately. Someone had tried to bury Margaret Whitmore alive. I turned to look at Richard, and what I saw on his face confirmed my worst suspicions. He wasn't looking at his mother with relief or joy or even shock. He was looking at her with fury and fear. His face was twisted with rage, and for just a moment before he controlled his expression, I saw pure hatred in his eyes. He took a step backward, away from the casket, and I saw Veronica grab his arm, whispering something urgent in his ear. Mr. Pemberton had sunk to his knees on the road, his face buried in his hands. He was muttering something over and over, and when I got closer, I heard what he was saying. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The pieces started falling into place in my mind, creating a picture so horrible that I wanted to reject it, but I couldn't. The evidence was right there in front of me. Margaret hadn't died of a heart attack. She'd been drugged or poisoned, put into some kind of coma that mimicked death closely enough to fool a cursory examination. And then she'd been sealed in a casket and scheduled to be buried alive, where she would have suffocated within hours, and no one would ever have known. It was the perfect murder. Except I had heard her. I had stopped the procession, and now the truth was about to come out. The ambulance arrived with shocking speed, the paramedics having been nearby by pure chance. They worked quickly, carefully extracting Margaret from the casket and placing her on a stretcher. She was conscious, but barely, her vital signs weak and erratic. One of the paramedics, a woman with short gray hair and competent hands, looked up at us with an expression of disbelief. "How long was she in there?" she asked. 3 days, Patricia said, her voice breaking. "They said she died 3 days ago." The paramedic's eyes widened. 3 days? And she's still alive? She shook her head in amazement and turned back to her patient, working even more urgently. "We need to get her to County General immediately. She's severely dehydrated, hypothermic, and showing signs of drug toxicity. I don't know how she survived this long, but she needs intensive care right now." They loaded Margaret into the ambulance, and Patricia climbed in with her. Before they closed the doors, Margaret's hand reached out, and her eyes found mine. Her lips moved, forming silent words I could barely make out. "Thank you." Then the doors closed, and the ambulance sped away, sirens wailing. The scene that erupted after the ambulance left was pure chaos. People were shouting, crying, demanding answers. Someone called the police, and I heard multiple sirens approaching. Richard was on his phone, speaking in urgent, angry tones to someone. Veronica had disappeared into one of the cars, her face hidden behind dark sunglasses. Mr. Pemberton was being questioned by several family members, and he'd gone from apologizing to claiming he knew nothing, that he'd just been following instructions. I stood beside the now empty casket, my whole body shaking with adrenaline and shock. I'd been a driver for 15 years, and in one moment everything had changed. I'd saved a woman's life, but I'd also uncovered what was clearly an attempted murder, and I had no idea what was going to happen next. A hand touched my shoulder and I jumped. It was Thomas, Patricia's husband, a quiet man I'd always found decent. "Thank you," he said simply. "If you hadn't stopped, if you hadn't listened." His voice broke, and he couldn't continue. I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The police arrived and immediately took control of the scene. They separated everyone, taking statements, asking questions. When they got to me, I told them everything I'd seen and heard, leaving nothing out. The detective listening to me, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, wrote everything down carefully. "You potentially saved Mrs. Whitmore's life," she said when I finished. "But you also potentially exposed yourself to danger. If this was an attempted murder, and it certainly looks that way, then the people responsible are dangerous. They're wealthy, powerful, and they clearly have no moral boundaries. You need to be careful, Mr. Mitchell." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't thought about my own safety. I just reacted to save Margaret. But now, looking at Richard's cold eyes watching me from across the road, I realized the detective was right. I'd made myself a target, and I had no idea how to protect myself from people with unlimited resources and no conscience. Have you ever suddenly realized you've stepped into something far bigger and more dangerous than you ever imagined? That's exactly where I found myself that day, standing on a country road surrounded by police and angry billionaires, knowing that my simple life as a driver would never be simple again. The investigation that followed was intense and sprawling. The police seized Margaret's medical records, interviewed her doctors, and investigated everyone who'd been involved in declaring her dead and arranging the funeral. What they discovered was even worse than I'd imagined. Margaret hadn't died of a heart attack at all. She'd been poisoned with a sophisticated cocktail of drugs designed to mimic death by dramatically slowing her heart rate and breathing to almost undetectable levels. The doctor who'd signed her death certificate was Richard's personal physician, a man who'd been on the Whitmore family payroll for years. Under questioning, he admitted that Richard had paid him $500,000 to falsify the death certificate without performing a proper examination. Mr. Pemberton, the funeral director, had been paid even more to expedite the funeral process, to skip the embalming that would have definitely revealed Margaret was still alive, and to ensure the casket was sealed quickly and securely. He'd known something was wrong, he admitted tearfully to investigators. He'd suspected Margaret might not be actually dead, but the money had been too good, and he'd convinced himself he was wrong, that surely the doctor wouldn't have made such a mistake. But the most shocking revelation came when they searched Richard's home office and found detailed plans for the entire scheme. He'd been planning this for months, ever since Margaret had told him about her intention to change her will. He couldn't risk losing his inheritance, couldn't accept that his mother would give away the fortune he felt entitled to. So he decided to kill her before she could change the will, to make it look natural, and to ensure she was buried quickly before anyone could discover the truth. Veronica had been his accomplice, helping him acquire the drugs through her connections in the pharmaceutical industry. They'd carefully calculated the dosages, tested them to make sure they'd create the appearance of death without actually killing Margaret immediately. The plan had been for her to wake up hours after burial, alone in the dark, and slowly suffocate as the air in the sealed casket ran out. No one would ever know. It would be the perfect crime, except they hadn't counted on me. They hadn't counted on a driver actually paying attention, actually caring enough about Margaret to notice something was wrong. Margaret spent 2 weeks in intensive care. The drugs had done serious damage to her system, and the 3 days sealed in the casket had pushed her body to its absolute limits. But she was strong, stronger than anyone had given her credit for. She fought her way back from the edge of death with a determination that amazed her doctors. I visited her in the hospital several times, though I felt awkward doing so. What do you say to someone whose life you saved? How do you bridge the gap between a billionaire and a driver under such circumstances? But Margaret made it easy. The first time I came to see her, she grabbed my hand with surprising strength and looked me directly in the eyes. "James," she said, her voice still weak but clear, "you gave me my life back, not just by stopping that procession, but by caring enough to listen when no one else did. How can I ever thank you for that?" I didn't know what to say, so I just held her hand and told her I was glad she was okay. We talked for a long time that day, and in the days that followed. She told me what she remembered from those 3 terrible days. The memories were fragmentary, nightmare images that would probably haunt her forever. She remembered feeling suddenly dizzy at dinner, Richard's concerned face hovering over her as her vision went dark. She remembered brief moments of consciousness, feeling like she was underwater, unable to move or speak or open her eyes. She remembered hearing voices, Richard's voice, telling people she'd had a heart attack, that it had been quick and peaceful. She'd tried to scream, to move, to do anything to let them know she was still alive, but her body wouldn't respond. The drugs had paralyzed her completely while leaving her partially conscious, trapped in her own body. She remembered the sensation of being lifted, moved, placed in something soft, the casket. She'd known what was happening but couldn't stop it. The lid closing above her was like a door to hell shutting, sealing her in darkness. And then the worst part, being alone in that darkness for hours, then days, slowly regaining more control of her body as the drugs wore off, but being sealed in a space too small to move, too tight to breathe properly. She'd screamed until her throat was raw, but the sound was muffled by the casket's padding. She'd beaten her fists against the lid until they were bloody, but the casket was too strong. She'd felt herself getting weaker, the air getting thinner, and she'd known she was going to die there, buried alive by her own son. But then she'd felt movement. The casket was being transported. This was it, she thought. They were taking her to be buried. This was her last chance. She'd gathered every ounce of strength she had left and moved her hand, scratched at the casket lid, made any sound she could, and somehow, miraculously, I'd heard her. She cried when she told me this part of the story, and I'll admit, I cried too. The thought of what she'd endured, the terror and betrayal and helplessness, was almost too much to bear. And the fact that I'd almost missed it, that I'd almost convinced myself I was imagining things and kept driving, haunted me. If I'd second-guessed myself for even a moment longer, Margaret would be dead now, buried in the family plot with no one ever knowing the truth. The weight of that alternate reality, the path we'd so narrowly avoided, was crushing, but we hadn't taken that path. I had listened to my instincts and Margaret was alive. Sometimes that's all that matters. The tiny decisions we make, the moments when we choose to act instead of doubt, can change everything. The trial was a media sensation, one of the biggest criminal cases of the decade. Richard and Veronica were charged with attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, and a dozen other crimes. The doctor and funeral director turned state's evidence, testifying against them in exchange for reduced sentences. The courtroom was packed every day, with news crews camped outside, broadcasting every detail to a public that couldn't get enough of the story. I had to testify, of course. Walking into that courtroom, seeing Richard and Veronica sitting at the defense table with their expensive lawyers, was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I told the jury exactly what I'd heard, what I'd seen, what I'd done. Richard's lawyer tried to make me seem unreliable, suggesting I'd been drinking, that I was looking for attention, that I'd created a false emergency for my own benefit. But the evidence was overwhelming. The drugs in Margaret's system, the falsified death certificate, the money trails, the written plans found in Richard's office, everything pointed to a calculated, cold-blooded attempt to murder Margaret for her money. The most devastating moment of the trial came when Margaret herself took the stand. She was strong by then, almost fully recovered physically, though the psychological scars would probably never fully heal. She testified for 2 days, describing every moment of her ordeal, every sensation, every thought. She talked about lying paralyzed in her own bed, listening to her son discuss funeral arrangements, knowing he'd poisoned her, knowing he was going to bury her alive. She described the horror of the casket, the suffocating darkness, the growing certainty that she would die there. And then she described hearing the car stop, hearing voices, seeing light for the first time in 3 days when that casket lid opened. "My son tried to kill me," she said, looking directly at Richard. "The child I gave birth to, raised, loved unconditionally, decided my life was worth less than money. He looked me in the eye and poisoned me. He listened to me gasp for breath and told everyone I was dead. He sealed me in a coffin and planned to bury me alive. How do you come back from that? How do you ever feel safe again?" The courtroom was silent except for the sound of crying. Even the judge had tears in his eyes. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. Richard and Veronica were each sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The doctor got 20 years. Mr. Pemberton got 15. Justice had been served, but it felt hollow somehow. No punishment could undo what had been done. No prison sentence could erase Margaret's trauma or restore her faith in humanity. The damage was permanent, irreversible, but at least they'd been stopped. At least they couldn't hurt anyone else. Margaret stood outside the courthouse after the verdict, surrounded by cameras and reporters, and made a statement. "My son tried to take everything from me," she said. "My life, my legacy, my peace. But he failed, thanks to one man who cared enough to listen. James Mitchell didn't know me well. I was just another client to him, one of many wealthy people he drove around. He had nothing to gain by stopping that funeral procession and everything to lose. But he did it anyway, because he listened to his conscience, because he valued human life over convenience and protocol. And that decision saved my life." After the trial, Margaret did change her will, just as she'd originally planned. The bulk of her fortune went to charitable causes, hospitals, schools, programs for at-risk youth. Patricia received a substantial inheritance, enough to live comfortably and continue her own charitable work. Richard, even after his conviction, was written out completely. He chose money over love, Margaret said, so he'll get neither. But the biggest surprise came when Margaret's lawyer contacted me. I was being given a generous gift as thanks for saving her life. Enough money to pay off my mortgage, send my daughter to any college she wanted, and retire comfortably when the time came. I tried to refuse at first. I hadn't done it for money. I'd done it because it was right. But Margaret insisted, and eventually I accepted, not for myself, but for my daughter's future. More than the money, though, Margaret gave me something else, a friendship. We stayed in touch regularly, meeting for coffee, talking about life and mortality and second chances. She told me once that surviving that ordeal had changed her perspective on everything. "You don't really understand how precious life is until you feel it slipping away," she said. "Every moment is a gift, James. Every breath, every sunrise, every conversation. I was dead, or as close to dead as you can be and come back. And now I'm alive again. Really, truly alive for the first time in years. The experience changed me too in ways I'm still discovering. I'm more aware now, more present. I pay attention to the small details, the quiet signals that something might be wrong. I trust my instincts more, even when logic tells me I'm being foolish, because I learned that sometimes your gut knows things your brain hasn't figured out yet. I also learned that social class doesn't matter as much as we think it does. I was just a driver, someone most wealthy people barely noticed. But I was the one who saved Margaret's life, not her powerful friends, not her business associates, not the people who claimed to care about her. Me. Because I paid attention, because I cared. That taught me that every person has value, every voice matters, and you never know when you might be the only one standing between someone and disaster. I look at people differently now, especially those in service positions like I was. The cleaners, the servers, the drivers, the people society often treats as invisible. They see things, they know things, they matter, and sometimes they're heroes without anyone ever realizing it. Margaret launched a foundation in honor of her experience, dedicated to investigating suspicious deaths among the elderly and vulnerable. She'd been shocked to learn how often people are declared dead prematurely, how many medical mistakes happen, how easily the system can be manipulated by those with money and connections. The foundation funded better training for medical examiners, supported legislation requiring more thorough death investigations, and provided resources for families who suspected their loved ones had been victims of foul play. It became her life's work, a way to transform her trauma into something that could help others. She asked me to serve on the foundation's board, and I accepted. It was strange at first, sitting in boardrooms with wealthy philanthropists and medical experts, offering my perspective as someone who'd been on the ground level of this nightmare. But my voice mattered there. My experience mattered. And together, we started making real changes, preventing other families from going through what Margaret had endured. As for me, I eventually retired from driving and now work full-time with the foundation, traveling the country, speaking about my experience, training first responders and medical professionals to recognize the signs of premature death declarations. It's meaningful work, the kind that makes me feel like my life has purpose beyond just getting through each day. My daughter graduated from college with honors and is now in medical school, inspired by Margaret's story to pursue a career where she can help people. Sometimes life takes you in directions you never expected. A few years ago, I was just a driver, living a simple, quiet life. Now I'm part of something bigger, something important, all because I listened when everyone else was deaf, all because I had the courage to stop that hearse, even when it made no logical sense. all because I chose to trust that small voice inside that said something was wrong. I think about that day often, November 18th, the day that changed everything. I think about all the small choices that led to Margaret's survival. If I'd been assigned to a different funeral that day, if I'd been playing music and hadn't heard her moving, if I'd convinced myself I was imagining things and kept driving, if I'd cared more about keeping my job than investigating strange sounds, any one of those alternative choices would have resulted in Margaret's death. The margin between life and death was so thin, so fragile, just a few moments of attention, a willingness to act on instinct, a choice to care. That terrifies me sometimes, how easily it could have gone the other way. But it also empowers me, because it means that ordinary people, doing ordinary jobs, can make extraordinary differences. You don't have to be rich or powerful or special to save a life. You just have to pay attention. You just have to care. You just have to be willing to act when something feels wrong, even if everyone else thinks you're crazy. Margaret tells me sometimes that I gave her a second chance at life. But the truth is, she gave me something too. She gave me purpose. She showed me that kindness matters, that noticing people matters, that the smallest actions can have the biggest consequences. She taught me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about acting despite the fear, doing what's right even when it's hard, standing up even when you're standing alone. I was terrified that day on the road, terrified of being wrong, of looking foolish, of losing my job. But I did it anyway. And that decision didn't just save Margaret's life, it changed mine. It showed me what I was capable of. It revealed strength I didn't know I had. And it connected me to something larger than myself, a mission to protect others, to prevent similar tragedies, to make sure that no one else suffers what Margaret suffered. The scars from that experience are real, for both of us. Margaret still has nightmares about the casket, about the darkness, about the suffocating helplessness. I still have moments where I wonder if I could have acted faster, if I could have prevented some of her suffering. We've both been through therapy, working through the trauma and the guilt and the complicated emotions that come from surviving something that shouldn't have been survivable. But we've also found healing in the work we do together, in the lives we've helped save through the foundation, in the knowledge that something good came from something terrible. That's important, I think. Finding meaning in suffering, transforming pain into purpose, using the worst moments of our lives to create better moments for others. It doesn't erase what happened, but it makes it bearable. It makes it worthwhile. So here's what I want you to take away from my story. First, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't let fear or doubt or social pressure silence that inner voice that tells you to pay attention, to investigate, to act. Second, every person you encounter has value. The person serving your coffee, driving your car, cleaning your office, they're not invisible. They're human beings with thoughts and feelings and observations that matter. Treat them with respect. Listen to them. They might just save your life someday. Third, courage is a choice. It's not something you're born with. It's something you choose in the moment when it matters most. You might be terrified. You might doubt yourself. But you can still act. You can still do the right thing. And finally, life is fragile and precious beyond measure. We all act like we have unlimited time, like tomorrow is guaranteed. But it's not. Margaret was almost buried alive at 62, with so much life still ahead of her. None of us knows how much time we have. So use it well. Love the people who matter to you. Do work that means something. Pay attention to the world around you. Make choices you can be proud of. Because in the end, that's all we really have. Our choices. Our moments, our impact on the lives around us. If you've made it this far in my story, thank you for listening. Really listening, the way I listened to those faint sounds coming from Margaret's casket. Your attention matters. Your time matters. And I hope my story has given you something to think about, something that might change how you see the world or how you interact with the people around you. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right? Have you ever had to trust your instincts, even when everyone thought you were wrong? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. Share your stories of courage, of listening to that inner voice, of making difficult choices. Because we all have these moments, these crossroads where we decide what kind of person we're going to be. And by sharing these stories, we remind each other that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things. If this story touched you, if it made you think differently about life or death or the value of paying attention, please hit that like button. Let me know it resonated with you. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about real people facing impossible situations and finding the courage to do what's right, please subscribe to I Live to Tell. Click that notification bell so you never miss a story. Because these stories matter. These moments of human courage and compassion and choice, they're what make life meaningful. They're what remind us that even in our darkest moments, even when evil seems to triumph, good people still exist. People who care, people who listen, people who act. Thank you for being here with me today. Thank you for caring about Margaret's story and mine. And remember, you never know when you might be called upon to be someone's hero. So stay alert, stay compassionate, and always, always trust that voice inside that tells you when something's wrong. It might just save a life, maybe even your own.